Hello everyone, this is Steve Marinucci, welcoming you to yet another edition of Things We Said Today, our weekly deep Beatles talk show where we will talk about anything related to the Beatles. Before we get started, I want to introduce everybody that's with us today. First of all, the gentleman who is the host of Every Little Thing, Mr. Ken Michaels. Hello, Ken.
Hi, Steve. Hi, everybody.
And from Beatle Fan Magazine, who has been there from the very beginning, the very, very beginning, Mr. Al Sussman. Hey, Al.
Hi, Steve. How you doing? Hello there, everybody.
And last but not least, the man who has interviewed the Beatles more than any of us, who has celebrated life with the Lions more than any of us.
I wouldn't be too sure of that.
No, okay. and says, and I'm going to embarrass you now, Alan, who says he's going to stay a Yankees fan while living in New England, Mr. Allan Kozinn. Hello, Alan.
Hey, Steve. Hello, everybody. And that doesn't embarrass me.
Okay. Anyway, today we just passed the anniversary. It was released in 1970 of Let It Be. And we thought we would talk about the movie and the album and the significance, what significance it holds now. Obviously, what Apple has done with it, what they should do with it. And like I said, we're going to talk about both the movie and the album. I'm going to start with let's start with the album first. When the album was released, what did you guys think of it individually? Let's start with Ken. Ken?
Well, I was kind of young at the time, so I don't quite remember as it was released. It's only later on as I listened to it. I mean, certainly as Beatle albums were released, I did buy them. Maybe not the day of its release, but certainly around that time. But I always enjoyed it. I loved, the rawness of the band. I wasn't really making comparisons between this and their previous albums. And being at the time, I would have been almost 11. I wasn't really aware of what the state of the band was in at the moment, and I didn't really let that affect how I thought about the music. I always liked all the songs on there. I liked the variety of it. Obviously, the hits with Let It Be and The Long and Winding Road. How it opened with Two of Us. That's one of those great album openers, which the Beatles were so skillful at doing. Loved the rock and roll in there. Loved One After 909, which was such a, powerful, good 50s-ish type rock and roll song. I've Got a Feeling was great. Everything about it I really enjoyed. I certainly wasn't thinking about the Phil Spector influence. I wasn't thinking, was he overproducing anything? Like The Long and Winding Road or Across the Universe. I thought that the production on those songs were just fine the way they were. That's the way I grew up hearing these songs.
Okay.
And hearing them first before hearing outtakes and Beatles anthology versions and all that. But I loved all of it. As someone who wasn't making comparisons, who just took it in as an album at the moment, I loved it just like all the other Beatles albums.
Okay.
So,
interesting. Because my first impression, and I'm a little older than you are. I remember it, listening to it and hearing reading the Scuttlebutt and Rolling Stone that it was going to be, back to the roots kind of thing, and then hearing the album and being a little disappointed that it wasn't. But and still to this day, to listen to it, I've never, it's hard to appreciate the Phil Spector album. I guess I appreciate it a little more now than I did back then, but it was hard to appreciate it, especially given what we had hoped was going to come. Al, what did you think of the album?
Funny thing is, I think Alan and I probably had a similar experience going back to previous conversations we've had, because this was the first time that we had gotten a new Beatles album where we had actually heard a good portion of the album, maybe not in the same form previously, because obviously the Get Back album was the first Beatles album to be bootlegged.
Mm-hmm.
So we had heard a good portion of the album in rough form for several months. And plus the fact that it was, just a few weeks after Paul had, released his self-interview, which in effect made the announcement that he was leaving the group. It was something of an anticlimax, especially after, as you just alluded to, Steve, about a year of articles in Rolling Stone about this Back to the Roots album. And then having all of the delays and Abbey Road coming out in the interim, and then everything connected with the eventual breakup and all. So by the time it finally came out in May, it was both the album and the film too. It was something of an anticlimax.
Mm-hmm.
Did you feel the same, Alan?
I did, actually. I can go into maybe a little more detail. I totally agree with you, and my experience was very much the same, except that even before the bootlegs came out, and really the source of the bootlegs were a couple of acetates that leaked out to radio stations in the U.S. of the Glyn Johns mix for the Get Back album.
Right.
So if you look back at the whole period, okay, they recorded this thing in January 1969. In the spring of 1969, the Get Back single comes out with Don't Let Me Down. And we know that this is what they're working on for their new album. Mm-hmm. And it sounds really exciting because Get Back was a really fun single and Don't Let Me Down was a great song. And we knew, the beginnings of the John and Yoko story and the whole thing there. And we're reading into it, this is what John is thinking. And I just loved that single. And then we began hearing the reports in Rolling Stone that Alan Steve alluded to. I mean, Rolling Stone did a lot of coverage about what this album was going to be. And in fact, it became kind of a joke in the letters column where every few months someone would write in, so when is the Get Back album coming out? Mm-hmm. Because it was originally going to be called the Get Back album.
Right.
And there were all kinds of stories. It did originally come out in a box in England with a book, but I seem to remember reading a report about how it was going to come out in a wooden box. Anyone remember that?
No.
Yeah.
No, I don't remember that at all. Really?
Maybe just when I read that it was coming out in a box, that was the image that I had in mind. I don't know. I seem to remember hearing that was going to be it, and I'm thinking, how expensive is this album going to be, But we were hearing that, and then also we were hearing, by the end of 1969, months before the eventual album came out, we had already heard the acetate on, I think, WNEW or WABC FM played it in New York. And, as a little kid with a tape recorder, I was right there. So as soon as they played it, I had it for all the period in between, when it was first aired and when the album finally came out. So I was able to be very disappointed by the album because I was used to I was used to these very raw things with, a bit of Save the Last Dance for Me and all the talking in between. And I was really just hoping for a really good quality album of that. But then also you may remember, John used to do these interviews with Howard Smith. And in late 1969, he talked about the Get Back album, and he talked about it in very weird terms. He, I think, also really liked what the Glyn Johns album was at the time. I mean, he was involved in bringing Phil Spector in as well. But at the time, he was saying, this is the Beatles with their trousers down. This is going to explode the whole myth. I mean, he was just saying stuff like that. And, we were sort of thinking, well, I don't know what he means by that because the stuff I've heard is great. I mean, we heard Long and Winding Road with no strings and no choirs, and we heard Let It Be that way, too. And that's what we were used to, at least those of us with tape recorders at the time.
Right.
So when the album came out, in a way, I'm a little bit jealous of Ken's experience because he was able to experience it as a new Beatles album without all of the the history.
Yeah.
And
Right.
maybe I would like it more now if I had received it that way too. I have to say it's probably one of my least favorite Beatles albums.
Yeah.
Because I liked Long and Winding Road. I liked a lot better without the strings, and with the strings I found sort of really treacly and difficult to bear. And Paul apparently had that experience too, although bizarrely enough, as much as he complained about it, the live version that he's always done has been something like the Spectorized version.
Yeah.
Maybe a bit less, and for a while he did it with winds instead of strings, but there was always something else, and I kind of liked it plain, completely plain.
Yeah.
And all the little bits. I mean, we also first heard it with a dig-it that went on for 6 or 8 minutes, and then the album comes down and we get this little snippet. What's this?
Yeah, yeah. Did you hear the
Yeah.
acetates before, or I should say, yeah? Did you hear the acetates before the album came out? I mean, did you hear the radio broadcast?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Because I didn't, because I didn't hear him. I don't think until the bootlegs came out, and I was, and the same with the Get Back bootleg. I mean, I didn't hear that until after, and I don't think so. My memory's a little. I do remember where I heard it the first time, and believe it or not, Alan, you'll relate to this. I was on a journalism conference, and somebody had it. Somebody had the bootleg, and they were playing it in their room. And that room became very popular. But
what is it about journalists and bootlegs?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Really.
I don't know. But yeah.
Alan, I don't know if this is your experience, but I remember hearing the acetate on, I think it was WPLJ, or no, it was at that point. At that point, it was still WABC FM in November of '69.
Yeah, that sounds about right to me.
Yeah.
And I taped it. They also had the White Album early, and they had an odd mix, probably a little more like the Peter Sellers mix. And they played only about 10 songs of it, but I taped that as well at the time. And
Do you still have those tapes?
I have, I do have that tape. I don't have the Get Back one anymore because it was replaced with, better bootlegs. But, but it was great. I mean, we didn't necessarily, unlike the airing on WBCN in Boston has been bootlegged in its entirety, so what the DJs were saying and all that. Right. I mean, I didn't keep the DJs, and I'm not sure that. In New York, they played it completely and in order. You had to sort of wait around for the next track. So I'm not sure we knew what the running order would be, but we had basically the whole thing. And it was great. And that's why also when they did Let It Be Naked, I was really just hoping that the Glyn Johns album would come out, because to me that would have corrected a historical mistake,
Right. Yeah, I agree with you there, because I mean, that's what they intended to release. I mean, much as I said this, I think a couple of weeks ago, that I do like Let It Be Naked now. I was listening to it this morning, and I do like it. It sounds, for one reason, the sound is nice, is really warm. There's a really warm sound on that album that is missing from Beatle albums, I think, in general. So I really like that. But I agree, though. I wish Get Back would have come out. I mean, there's been some great bootlegs of that. I think there's a Japanese one that I've heard that's been wonderful. So I mean, there's been some great transfers of that original album, and why they didn't bother to do that is really, really sad. Let's go to the movie. When did you guys first see the movie? And again, I'll start with you, Ken. And what did you think of it?
God, this is going to be embarrassing me because I think I saw it probably. When was the first time I saw it? Probably in a movie theater on Long Island that had one of those theaters that would run a movie like Rocky Horror Picture Show. They would run a rock film, and it was probably, I would guess, late 70s, I probably saw it for the first time.
Okay.
I've seen it many times since, and actually, I watched it yesterday for the first time in probably 10 years or so.
Really?
So it's been quite a while, yeah, since I've seen that one. A Hard Day's Night and Help I've watched endlessly, and Magical Mystery Tour I've watched a lot, and Yellow Submarine not as much. But for whatever reason, I've never felt compelled to watch Let It Be. But watching it now for the first time in so many years, I have a lot of things to say about it that really surprised my own reaction to it, which was really that it wasn't as bad a film as I first remembered it,
Hmm.
or I was told it was, or it wasn't as depressing a movie as I thought it would be. In fact, I found it to be almost entirely enjoyable because I noticed a lot of the joy coming out of the band, not just the depression, not just the misery. There are a lot of great moments in there where they're having fun. And yes, you know that they're about to break up, but there's just so many incredibly great moments live there, and interesting in examining songs taking shape as well. And of course, the Apple Rooftop is fantastic.
Right.
Uh, the only thing that I kind of now as a criticism would make, but then this wasn't really the intent of the film, was I like seeing how a song evolves,
Mm.
and how a song takes shape and different arrangements of them. You hear two of us in this movie, and when they're rehearsing it, it's so much faster than the version that came out. And so I would have loved to have seen them discussing, let's slow it down, a little bit. And also the guitar intro that's so familiar with two of us changed just slightly
Hmm.
by the time that it was the release version. Just things like that I find really interesting. By the time that you get to the Apple Rooftop, the songs are finished, and they're exactly the way the Beatles wanted the songs to be.
Hmm.
You don't see any real development of the songs. You hear them early on, you hear loose rehearsals of them, and then, just finished. I don't want to call them polished because it's so raw, but yeah, it's polished too at the same time, the finished versions. I would have loved to have seen more of a development of the songs. But, there's some really fun moments in this movie.
Right.
I was really, for so many years, you keep hearing about the big argument between Paul and George. There's nothing. I'm watching this movie for the first time in, like I said, 10 years, and it's not as bad as I always remembered it to be.
Hmm.
I mean, I defy anyone who's ever been in a band or in any creative group who hasn't gone through something far worse than that argument.
Oh yeah.
And
Mhm.
as far as seeing the band signs of a breakup, what's just as telling or more so is and fascinating is when Paul is talking to John
Hmm.
and just explaining the problems he's having with George. That George doesn't want to do a live show. He doesn't want to do a TV show. He's having problems with George, and John acts like he could care less.
Right.
That's a very interesting moment there in the film. But as far as the music is concerned, it's incredible.
Well,
you know,
I disagree with you a little bit there because I think that moment with George, although it is, I think it gets a little overemphasized because people pull it out of context. I think there's some sharp. I wouldn't say bitterness, but I think there's some edginess there between George and Paul, definitely. And the fact that he brings it up to John later, who, by the way, from what I understand, and Alan, correct me on this, he was stoned most of the time through those sessions. That's why he really
Mhm.
couldn't care less.
Yeah.
So, that's, I mean, I think there was definitely some problem there between George and Paul, definitely. So, what's funny is you don't see any of it with Ringo, and Ringo, so I mean, Ringo's getting along with everybody, but I think I got caught up in the general feeling of the day that it was a downer movie, and you watch it and you kind of see everybody, kind of looking like they don't want to be there, but I remember too that Ron Furmanek told me a few years ago when I interviewed him that the movie the remastered movie in perfect quality takes on a whole different tone. And God, I so want to see that like that.
Yeah.
I think we all, I think, I
Mm.
know, I mean, we all do. But that sounds very, that sounds very likely that that's true. That I think the quality on all the copies I've seen, and I've seen a few. I haven't seen all of them. Is horrible. The bootlegs really don't do the movie justice at all. I have not seen the Blu-ray, the quote unquote bootleg Blu-ray. Have any of you guys seen that?
No, but it's just from the same sources, right?
Right. Right. I don't know.
Mm.
So,
I assume so, which means that it can't be. I mean, I've seen bad bad legal Blu-rays,
yeah.
and so I mean they can only do so much, and
Yeah.
and so I don't think the Let It Be Blu-ray is anything to write home about. If anybody listening has seen it, and I'm sure somebody has, we'd love to hear about it. But I really don't think that having not seen it, I'm not trying to scout it down. I'm not going to, but the bootlegs of the movie don't do it justice because the quality stinks. They all come from the laser disc basically, or even the
Yeah.
videotape, which is
Yeah.
just worse,
Right.
So there's
Right.
only so much, and some of those transfers go way, 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 way back,
Yeah.
So
And we saw bits in the anthology that give us a sense of what the quality of that film is like.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
and we've also seen bits in the anthology and in the little documentaries that they produced that went with the 2009 remasters
Mm-hmm.
that kind of show a whole other side of the performances too. I mean, we see a lot more of them smiling and having fun in those clips than we do in the movie altogether. Although there is a bit of that in the movie too, and
Mm-hmm.
and the rooftop concert is great, and that takes up the last 20 minutes of the film, so that's like a third of it almost. Yeah, the movie. I mean, I have mixed feelings about the movie too, for the same reason as the album. Not because, well, not quite the same reason. I didn't see bootlegs of the movie before the movie came out, but it's hard now to separate, in our minds what we know historically from what we see in the film. We see this little argument with Paul and George that doesn't look like much, but we know that what happened was, George was not just upset with Paul, he was upset with John too. Partly because John was stoned at so many of the sessions, and partly he was also beginning to feel, wait a minute, I am now writing songs that are as good as you guys, and I am not being given a fair shake here. And there is, okay, when they were making the film, as probably many of all of you guys know and many of our listeners know, because it was a film, they were running an audio recording through the whole thing, not just, the bits that the EMI consoles were getting, but this couple of Nagra recorders, which are high quality recorders, were on all the time. And all of those tapes have gotten out onto the bootleg market. I'm just looking on my iTunes where I have them all, and it doesn't say how many minutes and hours. It lists that bunch of tape as 4 days worth of tape. So 2,164 tracks they've broken it into. So and we get to hear everything, and we get to hear exactly what Ken would like to hear. And I mean, one of my favorite sort of scenes in this batch of unreleased tape is they're working on Get Back, and first of all you hear Paul telling Mal to go get a pencil and paper. So it's partly, interestingly, we get to hear what the dynamic is. Okay, Mal, be ready. And then they're going through lyrics, and Paul says, okay, I've got it. Jojo left his home in Tucson, Arizona. And John says, is Tucson in Arizona? And Paul says, yeah, it's where they filmed High Chaparral. And that is just a great moment. I mean, we've been listening to that record for years and years and years. And here is that line being written and being questioned and being justified. And, what more could you want, but you also get to hear, Two of Us in its fast version, its slow version, its everything version. The same with Get Back. I mean, there are versions of Get Back that are absolutely sizzling rockers.
Right.
Much different than what happened with it. So, but there are also other kinds of arguments on here. And there is a long section called the lunchroom tape where they all went to lunch after George left and are talking about the dynamics in the group. And John is being very forthright about how, he was always pushing for it to be his way and not paying any attention to George. And, it's very revealing. It's kind of hard to hear because they hid the microphones among apparently the silver service. So you keep hearing all this silver jangling around. But, it's this is the one Beatles album, and I have to say, it being my least favorite Beatles album, it's a pity that this is the one, but this is the one that we have tape of the entire sessions for. And that alone makes it fascinating because you do get to hear the songs. You hear Paul coming in with one of his songs and sort of vamping through it and calling out the chords to the others who pick up on it. And, it's really great stuff if you want to hear how songs are made. But the film, I saw the film when it came out and was a little down on it just because, that whole period seemed to be such a mess, with the one redeeming thing that had happened in between the time we first heard the acetate and before the album came out is that Abbey Road had come out. And Abbey Road was brilliant, and it just seemed like, okay, well, maybe there's a chance for them to stay together and do some good stuff because that stuff on side two, I mean, they're cooking. Sure. And but then the movie, and you sort of had to realize that the movie was from before Abbey Road, but it still was. It felt like kind of a downer, So I do hope that I do hope when they put it out, they not only give us the movie as it was in super quality, but also a disc of other stuff from those sessions that were much more fun.
Although the precedent of them putting that fly on the wall disc in with Let It Be Naked is not promising.
Right.
As far as,
exactly.
Much in the way of treasures that might be part of a Let It Be DVD. I remember seeing the film probably around the same time you did, Alan. And again, this is just a few weeks after the breakup became semi-official, and so you're kind of going in with 20/20 hindsight because you are looking at a film where you are seeing, at least in part, the dissolution of the band, but the rooftop concert makes it really worthwhile. And I can remember as depressing as 2/3 of the film was, the effect of the rooftop concert had me leaving that theater, about 2 feet off the ground. It was that good. But it's unfortunate that the rest of it is so choppy. Even technically is so choppy and kind of disjointed. It's it would be nice to get a kind of a very much reconstructed version, but I kind of doubt if that's ever going to happen.
Right.
This is all interesting what you're saying here, Al. I definitely agree that the film is choppy, but I still don't think that this film is 2/3 depressing. I mean, there's so many great moments there in this movie. I love there's that one moment when Paul and Ringo are doing this boogie woogie thing at the piano, and you can tell they're having a lot of fun.
Oh yeah.
And you also notice whenever they do 50s rock in particular, they seem to be really clicking on
Hmm.
that, and they seem to really be enjoying it, maybe even more so than their own songs, because it's something that they all shared in common with each other. When they're doing the shake, rattle, and roll bit,
Yeah.
that's a great moment there in the movie. Yeah, just the little things like when they rehearsed Across the Universe, and you can hear Paul harmonizing on the song, just hearing his voice, very clear, singing with John, which is it's a different from the version that was released,
Hmm.
and just great moments like that. There's a whole bunch of them throughout the film, and I just found it being like in the blink of an eye, it was over. I really just thoroughly enjoyed this movie. I didn't look at it as being, well, they're breaking up here, folks. Yes, we know that, but I think sometimes, like Alan was saying, we're kind of tainted in the way that we look at this thing because we know at that moment that they had broken up. That's when
Well,
the film came out, right at that time.
especially right, exactly, and especially since Alan and I both saw it, really right after, within just a few weeks after Paul had made his exit. And
Yeah.
so obviously all of that and all of these, very, ominous reports and things that had been coming around since mid-January, contributed to the feeling, where we really were going in thinking,
Yeah.
oh, we're going to basically be watching the group break up.
Hmm.
So, so I think you probably, Ken, I think you probably saw it. You went in probably with a very different perspective than having seen
Yeah.
it so close to
Hmm.
to the, at least the semi-official breakup itself.
I
Yeah, but I try to look at everything here in the movie, and I do see a lot
Mm-hmm.
of joy here. And just the mere
Mm-hmm.
fact that, once you study the history and you know that right after these sessions, they still hung around together, and they still did Abbey Road. They must have still loved each other enough
Mm-hmm.
to put together a great album like that. So it couldn't have been, depending on what you read, you're either going to believe that it was all misery during January of 1969, or you watch a film like this and you see some of the fun moments and you listen to a lot of the bootlegs and you'll hear a lot of the joy that's there as well as the
Hmm.
misery. So you
Hmm.
got to hear both because that's the only way
Yeah.
you get the full picture.
Well,
I think it's really important to remember here that the quality of the prints may have had a lot to do with everybody's feelings about this. And
Mm.
again, if we were to see an excellent quality print, I mean, what you can see in the anthology excerpts is only, is just kind of is just tantalizing. But I mean, if we were to see, the full length print, I wonder what the feelings would be. Alan, you haven't, I would assume, have you seen lengthy excerpts beyond what they've shown on the anthology?
Not really. But I should mention
Hmm.
that there is a recent bootleg that just came out within the last couple of weeks that is basically Neil Aspinall's working print for Long and Winding Road,
Right.
which of course became the anthology.
Hmm.
And it includes a long segment from Let It Be, from right after George left, and John, Paul, Ringo, and Yoko are doing a very wild jam. And we, of course, have heard the audio of that because of the Nagra reels, but
right.
never saw it before. And actually, they look like they're having a good time there.
No,
You know,
that jam has been out, at least parts of it.
on
I don't,
video.
yeah, I've seen. I don't know how much is included. I don't have that. I haven't seen that bootleg, so I can't tell you. I don't know
Yeah,
how long,
goes
but
on for a while. Yeah, goes on certainly longer than anything I've seen, and I was kind
okay,
of in a way surprised that Neil would have included that much of it.
okay.
But they, it's not like they're sitting there tolerating Yoko. They are completely into it.
Right.
So,
That's what's really amazing, especially when you hear all of that, the complaining about Yoko, and you hear people talking about, well, she was in the session and she shouldn't have been there, and stuff. But that in that particular moment, they were enjoying it. They were appreciating her, if you want to call it that. But yeah, that's a very interesting moment.
Mm.
Did you ever ask her about that, Alan?
I didn't know.
Yeah, I don't recall asking her about that either. I'm sorry I didn't now. But yeah, that would have been. I would love to have heard her reaction to that. I mean, but the way she usually is. I mean, she's very comfortable with her art, and yeah, that's an amazing moment in the movie. Let me ask. I mean, obviously, without asking, everybody's going to say it should be released. And how do you think it should be released? Ken, let's start with you. How do you think the movie should come out?
Uh, I want the film exactly as it is, as one disc, and then another disc with a lot of bonus material.
Hmm.
I mean, there should be several hours of bonus material because there's so much that does exist, and also bonus audio. I'm not saying that we should, put out everything that's been bootlegged audio-wise, but certainly you can come up with one or two CDs worth of really strong material. That the Beatles wouldn't be or shouldn't be embarrassed by. But then again, how the fans feel and how the Beatles feel, are two completely different things, and usually has been.
Right.
So I think there should be a lot of bonus material, definitely, behind that. And maybe a nice photo book to go along with it. There's so many ways you can go with this. But the mere fact that it's been out of print for so long, and there's so much material that does exist, they really should do something really nice for this.
Yeah, Alan?
Yeah, I agree with Ken. I mean, I think that would be a really good approach. There's easily more than a couple of discs worth of good material from the audio material that they could put out. I mean, the thing about the audio material is a lot of it is working versions and some of it is a little sloppy and they're missing lines and all that. But I don't really think that matters. I think at this point, everybody knows what the sessions were. And I think it would be really interesting to see some songs evolving over a couple of discs and some of the oldies that they sort of, touch on sometimes just for a few minutes and then go on to something else. And, some of them are actually pretty funny. And not to mention that they run through a whole lot of material that did not end up on Let It Be in those sessions. There's quite a lot from George, Hear Me, Lord, and other things from All Things Must Pass Itself is sure. in the sessions and something. And, Paul has quite a few things. Backseat of My Car makes an appearance in these sessions. And, yeah. So, there's a lot. I mean, someone could really distill these 4 days worth of tracks into something good. I do think that the idea of having a version of the film as it was and a bonus version of the film, I kind of wonder, if the second disc, instead of being just bonus material, should be just like an alternate edit using other material that shows a different perspective of those sessions, that shows a bit of the brighter side, shows them working. And, also I just watched, before we started, I just watched the little documentary that they put out in 2009 with the albums, and both Paul and Ringo are quite enthusiastic about that material. Ringo says, when it didn't matter what was going on with us personally, once the music started, if we were into the music, that was all there was. And there's an aspect of that I'd like to see in the film footage that would come with it. I'm pretty sure that they are putting together a disc of extras like that. When I spoke to someone at Apple about it, to the degree that they could admit that that's what they were doing, they sort of did, but, they're very cagey because they're not allowed to talk,
Right.
But, yeah, I also know that they filmed a whole lot of supplementary interview material, including Neil and I don't know, I guess probably just all but John were alive at the time they did it. So there's probably a disc of interviews. They could put together quite a deluxe set. And this being what is it, 45th anniversary?
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Losing count. It would have been good. I mean, I hope they don't make us wait another 5 years to make it the 50th. But it would be great to see in really good shape. And I don't understand them, because people are putting out, as Steve mentioned, like things like a Blu-ray of a bootleg. I mean, wouldn't they rather people bought the stuff from them directly in the version that they would like us to see? It's
Right.
Sure.
it doesn't make sense to not put it out.
No, it doesn't. You know what else that actually I'm kind of afraid of is they'll re-edit the thing. I hope to God they don't decide to do that. I mean, they could very well do that.
They could. You think they'd bring Michael Lindsay Hogg in to do it?
No, I don't think so. I mean, they'd find somebody to do it. I don't think they'd have him do it. But I mean, they could. I'm thinking of what they did with the recordings on the anthology. I mean, they changed those around. They could very well, change the movie. It's I guess it's maybe hard to conceive, that they would do that, especially in light of Magical Mystery Tour, which, if anything, needed to be re-edited. It was that, and they didn't. So maybe they wouldn't, but I just that's kind of a little fear that pops in the back of my mind that maybe they'll mess with it. But I agree. I wish they'd get off the dime and get this thing done and quit. I mean, yeah, I agree with you, Alan, that the bootleggers are making tons of money. And it's just crazy to not put it out. It's just absolutely stupid not to do that.
But follow the history here. The Beatles have been completely unfazed by bootleggers. If they really cared about losing money from the bootleggers, they would have put out tons of other stuff by now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And really, what we do have are the 3 anthologies, and that's it. The 3 volumes. So they do things, on their own terms, and that's just the way it's always been.
Yeah, I mean, look at the Barrett tapes, look at the Roger Scott tapes. I mean, those have come out again recently, within the past year, and I think I just read this morning that they're out on silver disc if you want to get them on silver disc. But yeah, I mean, it's that those kind of things they really don't care about. They did react to the ultra rare and unsurpassed masters things, which kind of caused the anthology, but that's history now, and they won't do anything on that scale now. I mean, it's just impossible. They won't do it. But
well, Alan's idea about kind of an alternative version of the film is a good one. To have the package with the film as it was, with no edits of any kind, just as it was originally presented, but then have maybe an alternative version of the film which might have some of the more upbeat moments. That might be actually what could possibly finally break the logjam, which has been preventing the film from coming out for a number of years, because it's fairly common knowledge now, since we know that nothing goes out on Apple without the consent of all 4 directors.
Right.
That they're, regardless of which one has been the dissenting vote, or if there's been more than one dissenting vote, obviously there's has not been unanimous approval of putting it out. So possibly having an alternative version, say, of the film with some more upbeat material might be a way of actually getting it out. But what Alan also mentioned about possibly having, at least in miniature, the development of some of the songs, audio wise, I think would be excellent.
Let me ask this to each of you: who do you think is the holdup? Who's the holdup on this?
I'd say George. That's based on everything that I've heard without any real proof behind it. But he wasn't crazy about the film, and I heard before he passed away that he didn't want it out. And I just think the family is honoring his wish. And also, I must admit, based on some of the things that Alan has said in this show, that there have been a number of instances like Alan was talking about Shout, the way
Mhm.
that it came out on the Beatles anthology, that George
Yeah.
thought that the full version was too indulgent. And that's why there's only a 2-minute version of Shout. And George was the one who didn't want the full version of You Know My Name to
Hmm.
come out.
Hmm.
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 So you also said in a previous show, Alan, that you thought that it was Paul that was the holdout.
That's what I've heard. I felt what I've heard is that Paul feels that it makes him look too bossy. It makes him look like the heavy in the group, and that he just doesn't. Yeah, that he doesn't like that, and
I think that's
so
hilarious. I think that's hilarious.
yeah.
Well, remember that he's reacting
Well,
to John's comments
Hmm.
in Lennon Remembers,
Hmm.
in December of 1970, where he basically says that "Let It Be," and I'm paraphrasing, was made, by and for Paul.
Right.
So it's so in a way, and as we know, Paul has this tendency to revise history. So it's possible that if he has, a dissenting view of it now, of Let It Be coming out on DVD now, and if I recall, there have been comments from him recently where he's kind of poo-pooed the idea of it coming out on
Mm.
on DVD. It may be, again, him kind of bending history because he doesn't want the film coming out and showing him to be, the taskmaster that he
Yeah.
that he comes across in some of the, especially those very early morning Twickenham sessions
Right.
where he seems to be the only one who's awake.
But
Right.
the funny
yeah,
thing is,
but
and I understand why he comes across as the heavy, and
Mm.
he kind of does. But to give him some credit here, basically what you had was four extremely wealthy, self-satisfied guys who kind of, were at that point, we don't really have to work. Do we have to work? And then you listen to John's things that he says in the interview Al just mentioned, well, Paul was going to bring us in and rehearse us like we're a little band. Well, but the fact is, Paul was the only one who was saying, hey, guys, we are a band. We are the Beatles. We do
Yeah.
have to make an album.
Right.
Let's do it.
Right.
And I think that while, he may look like the heavy from a certain perspective, I think you have to sort of respect it to a certain degree because they wouldn't have been doing anything if he wasn't there,
Right. Right.
wanting
that's right.
I was going
And
to say exactly that whole thing probably wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for him. So.
Right.
yeah, I mean, anyone who studied Beatle history will know that Paul, towards the end, was the only one that was trying to motivate anybody
Hmm.
to do anything. If it wasn't for Paul, he wouldn't have had Abbey Road.
Mhm.
Right.
So yeah,
Pepper.
that I just wanted to bring up a couple of things because as far as hearing differences in songs, I mean mine, when the Beatles rehearsed that, there is this little guitar bit that's done in 4/4, which obviously they took out. But I found that to be kind of interesting. Anytime there's some difference between what was eventually released and what's in the film, I found it to be really, really interesting. And I also loved, another fun moment is when they're doing You Really Got a Hold on Me, because you do hear George singing it,
Yeah.
His voice is not really pronounced or forced. You can hear him singing to the microphone, and it's a lot of fun to hear that. And also, on the sad note, the expressions on the Beatles' faces kind of tell you where they were at during
Mhm.
this movie. And there's plenty of times, especially with Ringo, where he's looking really down.
Yes.
Hmm.
You can see so much in his face. There's so much expression in all of them, really, but especially Ringo in this film. And George, unfortunately, he comes across as being a sideman so much in this film because it's mainly Paul songs and John to a lesser degree. And John, sometimes there are moments when John looks like he's really enjoying himself in the band, but there are times when he just looks like he wants to be somewhere else.
And
So
perhaps
and Paul,
is.
well, By the way, just want to bring up something you just said, Al, that Paul's tendency to revise history.
Hmm.
I want to know if you could just, explain why you're saying that, because there are people who do accuse him of doing that, and I want to know in what way you think he does that.
Well, the most egregious one, of course, is his claim all these years that the Beatles were found and determined not to come to America until they had a number one record. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, the history shows the fact that they were booked for Carnegie Hall and booked for the Ed Sullivan shows weeks before they had that number one record. It was I think the only show that was actually booked afterward was the Washington Coliseum show because of the role that Carol James had in pushing "I Want to Hold Your Hand."
Okay.
But I mean that's the most obvious example, and there are other things too where he's the story that he's told for so many years about Blackbird,
Right.
and about
Uh-huh.
it being influenced by the civil rights movement.
Right.
The thing is that at the time, the White Album came out, and in interviews from that time, he never makes a reference to that song being influenced by the civil rights movement.
That's a really good point.
Well, we've talked about this before, and the thing is, sometimes, it is very possible that it was about that, but nobody bothered to ask him at that moment. It's not like
it's
Paul
also
has
that
talked
there's
about every. It's not like Paul has talked about every single song of his career, even from the Beatle days. You wish that it wasn't until many years from now, really. That was kind of the equivalent of what John had done in Playboy,
Right.
where he went through all the Beatles songs, and especially the ones that he'd written, or was the main writer. But I'm sure there are plenty of times where Paul just did not comment about some of the Beatles songs that he wrote, and we've known very little about it.
Well, but in the case of Blackbird, he did kind of comment in a chat with Donovan that was recorded at Abbey Road during a Mary Hopkins session, where he's
That's
playing Blackbird and he says, I hear Diana Ross was offended, and then he starts talking about the Birds. And that would have been a time he could have, would have made sense for him to say, but actually it's, about civil rights. And, but in fact, he's actually making a joke almost the other way, so that kind of makes me think that the Blackbird story is a later invention.
Okay, well, we don't know for sure.
That's true.
But
That's true.
I'd love to give Paul the benefit of the doubt, but you can always say he is the writer of the song, so who would know better than him?
Even beyond the Beatles, in talking about Wings in retrospect, years later, he tends to kind of use 20/20 hindsight and maybe, bend history to his own devices, or in some cases where he'll kind of slough off an album like Back to the Egg. I wish we had time last week to ask Lawrence Juber about that, because Paul seems now to feel that Back to the Egg is kind of a minor piece by Wings, and the mere fact that he hardly ever even I don't even think he's, except for Coming Up's not from there. I don't think he's ever performed anything from Back to the Egg.
No, in the '79 tour he did.
Oh,
the UK tour.
Okay, but that was just a couple of months later. That was basically running on top of the album. But in later years, he's kind of looked back on that album as being a quote unquote failure, even though it was a top 10 album.
Well, I don't know if you call that revisionism. I just think that's the way that his opinion has changed over time. And every artist, I mean, we'd love for
that is
isn't that what revisionism is?
Yes.
But do we only look at the success of the record as it comes out, or should we also be thinking about how it's viewed years later?
Well, you know where I stand on that.
You know, should we only think about, what happened when the record first came out, and if the record was a number one record, it must be a great record for all time? Or, are there certain records that diminish over time? That was the thing that I was bringing up, with Tom Frangione.
Right.
We were talking about Tug of War towards the end of the show. But,
Sure.
I just think that it's a natural thing that artists don't look at their own work the same way that the fans do in most cases.
Oh, that's
So,
true.
I would love for Paul to, applaud so many of the songs from his solo career that I love dearly, which he will hardly ever talk about, but that's the case with so many artists that we love. They don't see their music the same way the fans do. So, as a matter of fact, it's been a number of times now where Paul has been asked what his favorite album of his is, and he's mentioned the first McCartney album, which I like a lot. I wouldn't put it in the upper echelon of McCartney albums, but for some reason, it's an album that he holds dear. And a lot of it probably has to do with the time and what he was going through emotionally and, the whole vibe of the album, as opposed to just the compositions on the album. But, that's the way he sees things. And as much as I'd love for him to see his music the way I see it, we can't expect that of any artist. So maybe as he was doing Back to the Egg, he wasn't crazy about it the way some of his fans were. It's possible, There may be times now when he writes off a lot of music that we love from him. And we might turn our heads and say, how can you possibly say that? But he is the artist and he has a right to feel the way he does. But that's just the way it is.
Anyway, I think we got off a little crazy there,
but Al brought up the whole thing about revisionism. I think it's important. I think it's important to bring up.
Yeah, and especially in the case of Let It Be, it's a very relevant situation. I hope I really, maybe we should all just put up an online. There's probably an online petition somewhere. I'm not familiar with it off the top of my head. Maybe we should start one.
Online. I'm sorry to be the curmudgeon here again, but online petitions are stupid and useless.
Okay.
They have no meaning. Whenever I see one of those things on Facebook with an online petition, I just next. I don't pay any attention to them.
Getting back to Let It Be, there's one other thing. There's one other aspect to mention possibly. We talk about them looking depressed and all this stuff, and I think Steve or one of you mentioned some of the early morning scenes. There is that aspect too. I mean, John described the whole sessions, looking back at them as like the worst pile of badly recorded crap with a bad vibe to it you can imagine. Right. Yeah. And he was exaggerating perhaps a bit, but I think it had to do also with the fact that they were being filmed the whole time, and I think they found that very kind of restrictive. I think they wanted to have the freedom to have the fights they wanted to have, that are part of the creative process, without it being on film and without, feeling that they had an audience. I mean, these were guys who, generally speaking, didn't have other people at their sessions, and now they had a whole camera crew, which in effect means almost, potentially the whole world, because the cameras are recording all of this. And
you would think, though, that they could have stopped that if they wanted to. Because they took, for example, with Magical Mystery Tour, they were involved in the editing process there. They could have pulled some of that stuff out of Let It Be if they wanted to, you would think.
Yeah, but I think the whole thing made them uncomfortable as well. The fact that they were coming in early in the morning, the fact that they were at Twickenham Studios, which they really disliked, and then when they finally got to Apple, I mean, far be it from me to say that Magic Alex had not produced the studio that he was supposed to do, but he didn't, and they're working on borrowed equipment from EMI, which seemed to be okay, but it wasn't what they wanted ideally. So there were an awful lot of other disappointments besides not getting along, besides whatever George's issues with John and Paul were, and whatever John's issues were, and John's drug use, and John's attitudes about Yoko, or whatever. All of these things. All that may be part of it, but there's also this other part of it that I think we have to consider, which is that it was just an uncomfortable situation for them, and they're being filmed in it. They're being filmed being uncomfortable, so that could be why they look uncomfortable. It's just that aspect I think we need to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, these were not men who were used to being filmed in a film studio in early January at 8:00 in the morning. So it's no wonder they looked unhappy. They were used to recording under much different circumstances at 3 in the morning at Abbey Road Studios instead of 8 in the morning at Twickenham.
Right.
Right.
So
those are really good points. Can I bring up one more thing?
Sure.
Since you brought up revisionism.
Yes.
Revisionism here.
Right.
What if they did what we've suggested? What if they did a re-edit of the film and they showed more of their lighter, fun moments? There might be a lot of fans who might say, "Well, you're changing history here. It wasn't really like that."
Well, they're not changed. They're going to put the film out as, at least in my concept, put the film, and I think all of our concepts is to have in the DVD package, have the film as is with certainly a technically a better quality product, but the film itself should be as is. Then on a separate disc, sure, have a kind of a different perspective on those sessions, since there's so much footage available. I think.
Well, I agree that that's how it should be, but I'm just saying there might be some fans who think that is revising history. To show another side here, that there were a lot of fun moments, that it wasn't all drudgery.
Doesn't
I think Paul said during the sessions, "Welcome to the drudgery."
That doesn't mean you're revising history. You're just showing a different perspective of those sessions. Again, you're not changing the film. You're just
still film.
Yeah, it's still the film is as is.
All right.
So that's not changing history.
Okay, I'm all for it then.
That kind of gets back to what I was saying earlier about re-editing the film. I mean, if they do that, as long as they keep the original version, I'm okay with that. But my concern was that they would re-edit the basic film and supplant that as the original version, and that wouldn't be good as far as I'm concerned. But in any event, anybody else got any? Because I think we're getting down to the end here. Anybody got any other concerns or things that we didn't bring up about Let It Be?
Well, yeah, if there's 4 days of audio, there must also be 4 days of film. Maybe they should just make a 4-day version of Let It Be.
Oh my gosh! Has anybody? Have you guys all? Have you guys all sat through all the outtakes of the whole?
No, that's torture. No, the funny thing is, the one thing that we haven't really talked about is the music. We have the songs themselves that that either from the Get Back version, the Glyn Johns version, or from the the official Let It Be album. And there's coming after Abbey Road, it's again was something of an anticlimax, and it's certainly as Alan mentioned, it's his least favorite Beatles album, and frankly it's probably mine as well. But there are some nice moments. I'm in the minority in that I don't mind the Spectorized Long and Winding Road, especially given the fact that at the moment it came out, especially the fact that it was released as a single at that moment. That looked as if it was going to be the last Beatles single for at least some time to come, and so it kind of put a nice little punctuation mark on the Beatles story, and in fact it does. If you listen to, dare I say it, the One album, it does kind of wrap up that collection very nicely. So I don't really have that much of a problem with it. I mean, mine, Ken mentioned that the fact that the version that's in the film is a little bit different. Of course, we know that basically the version that was done in the film and the version which is on Let It Be are nearly a year apart.
Mm-hmm.
In when they were recorded. So so obviously there are going to be some differences. But
I meant in the arrangement. There's just that little guitar bit,
Yeah, exactly.
And I think on I Me Mine, Spector did actually some good work because they only recorded like a minute and 13 seconds or something of that song, and he looped it out to be a full-length song. I think that was a good decision, actually.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, anyway, gentlemen, I think we covered the subject really well. Thank you for all your comments. To anybody listening out there, if you have comments, we'd love to hear them. Whether you want Let It Be released, whether you want the Get Back album released, whatever's on your mind, we'd like to hear it. Things we said today, radio show @gmail.com. I'm not going to go through everybody. We're all on Facebook. If you want to contact us individually, or you can contact us through the show. We'll be back here next week, God willing, same time, and we're all over the place. We're on YouTube, we're on iTunes, we're on Podbean, we're everywhere. We're all over. We're all around you. But please check us out next week. Check up on Podbean. We have an archive of our past shows. You can hear some of our past topics and interviews. We last week mentioned we talked to Lawrence Juber. That's still there. So anyway, thank you for listening, and we will see you next time.